Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. It is a fact that we have free speech in this country, but sadly, too many people are afraid to use it. Donna Lieberman protects those who do. She's the executive director of the New York Civil Liberties Union. And I'm very glad that you're here today.
Well, thanks for having me, Ronnie.
What interests me is that NYCLU was started in the early 50s because of the climate of fear caused by McCarthy and the abridging of everybody's rights, right? Mm-hmm. And here we are today. I mean, things don't change, do they?
Well, you know, those who don't learn from history are condemned to repeat it. Yeah. Boy, are we living that out. The issues that the Civil Liberties Union has to deal with here in New York City and around the country since September 11th are just a repeat of the issues that many of which we thought we had dealt with once and for all. Some lessons we thought we had learned once and for all, but we're just dealing with the whole array of civil liberties issues, whether it's the right to protest, the separation of church and state, a secular society, wiretapping in the name of national security without bothering to go to court to get permission. The list goes on, and it's a scary business. Yeah. Being at the Civil Liberties Union, you really feel like you're on the front lines of preserving democracy.
Well, how do you manage to pass on a tradition? I mean, obviously we don't. They don't. I mean, I just am astonished. They don't teach civics in school anymore, do they?
Well, no, the kids have to pass a test.
Yeah. But here, I learned in 7th grade that the Congress declares war. And here we are, debating it.
Well, the president claims that, you know, Congress has declared war and given him authority to do virtually anything he wants, including, you know, eliminate, you know, judicial review and eliminating any role from Congress. It's really quite astounding, the power grab of this administration.
It's very frightening.
Mm-hmm. And by the way, when Congress passes a law that the president doesn't like, he uses this thing called a signing statement, which has been invoked by other presidents maybe like a dozen times in history. He's used it dozens of times, and what it does is it gets around the veto, the possibility of a veto override. If he doesn't like what a law says, he signs it, and he says, but I'm not going to instruct my government employees to follow this, and this, because I think they're impermissible, like on torture, for example.
So
small
he just
things
ignores
like that.
He ignores the
legislation. He ignores it. Yeah.
I read testimony you gave about the history of surveillance and I guess it was wiretapping and infiltrating organizations. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't put it down because, first of all, it was very compelling. But it goes way back. I mean, you talked about the early 1800s and right back up. But you talked about the Handshoe consent decree, right? And is that one of the things you thought had finally a victory had been won? Well,
you know, interestingly enough, when the Handshoe settlement was arrived at 2 decades ago.
Can you in one sentence describe it?
The Handshoe settlement was an agreement with the police department and opposition groups in the name of Barbara Handshoe. It was a class action that instituted procedural requirements that the police department had to go through in order to engage in surveillance of political organizations. Most significantly required some sort of a criminal predicate, some sort of a sense, an idea, fact-based, that there was some criminal activity associated with political activity before the police department could engage in surveillance. It's very complicated, but that's it kind of in a nutshell. And after September 11th, the city went into court and said, Handshoe, we can't do that anymore. It'll hamstring our efforts to protect national security in this critical time if we have to be sure that there's a critical criminal predicate before we engage in political surveillance. And what we've seen in the aftermath is just an almost mind-boggling increase in the amount of political surveillance that's going on. I mean, you can't have a demonstration in New York City without, 6 video cameras there, in addition to whatever the press has. Sometimes there are more police videotaping than there are protesters, and totally without regard to whether there's any criminal link or suspicious link.
Does the federal legislation supersede the state legislation?
Well, the federal Constitution is what supersedes it all,
right.
but there are regs in place, both with regard to the federal government and
well,
with
the
regard to the
discussion that's
city.
now taking place in the Congress on the Surveillance Act or whatever it's called, is that going to affect it even more?
It may. I mean, I think what we're seeing to some extent is the local government both mimicking what's going on the federal level, and the federal government, learning a couple of tricks.
One of the things that really astonished me, I mean, that was so obvious, it seemed to me, they also, the police department infiltrates groups. And just recently, the case in Florida where these guys were arrested because they had intentions to blow up the Sears Tower, I think it was. These are guys who I'm sure never heard of the Sears Tower until the infiltrator encouraged them and enabled them to develop this plan, and now they're on trial.
Well, I mean, the defense in a case like that is entrapment. And whenever the government engages in sting operations, setup operations, there's a danger of entrapment. Entrapment is sort of, defined in general as pushing somebody to do something that they wouldn't otherwise be inclined to do, criminal activity. And that's actually what gave rise to the Hanshu settlement in the first place. It was the Panther 21 trial.
Right.
They were on trial for a plot to blow up department stores and all sorts of other stuff. And it turned out after this 4-month trial that the only people who had any concrete ideas about doing anything illegal, like blowing anything up, were the government agents.
Right.
And the jury was out for 40 minutes and acquitted, everybody. So the problem that people don't necessarily understand when the police engage in political surveillance, they feel the pressure, and this was documented in the church committee when it had its hearings, decades ago, that the police feel under pressure to come back with something, and if there's no there, they make it up or they make it happen, and that's a real danger. And we saw the kind of old-time political surveillance of the 1950s, maybe it wasn't so bad, but during the lead up to the Republican National Convention, where the NYPD was fanned out all over the country, all over the world, getting information about people who were coming to New York to protest. Now, the police department has to get it, and they clearly don't. That protest is not on a spectrum of illegal activity. Protest is on a spectrum of legal activity, and it's none of the police department's business what goes on in those meetings unless they have suspicion of something illegal happening. And I think they don't draw the line appropriately.
You've done a lot of work on that, the arrests and that whole planning.
Absolutely. Yeah. The Civil Liberties Union, put out a report.
Right.
We were on the scene, getting permits, watching the demonstrations, observing the police, and reporting on, You
started arguing when the first demonstration before the war started, when New York was the only city that wasn't allowed to have a march.
That's right, February 15th. Right. We put out a report arresting protests. We didn't go into it planning to do a report, but in the day during the demonstration, our observers came back with stories, and we sent out an email saying, "Did something bad happen to you? Was your right to protest, interfered with in some way? Did you have trouble getting to the demonstration?" We were flooded. Hundreds of responses came back, and really we've seen a continuing pattern, the command and control approach to demonstrations that characterizes this administration.
And this is in the city that's
supposedly
so left-wing or liberal.
Right.
But you also do very local things.
Yes.
And your most recent report was on the security in school system.
Well, we've put out a lot of reports lately, but the one that I'd like to talk about is called Criminalizing the Classroom, the Over-Policing of the New York City Public Schools. It was done, the cover was done by a student who entered it before we even thought about the report in a contest we had for high school students. And you know, education, you know, is the ultimate local issue, and it's the key to
development
success.
Of people, and
it's the key to everything in our society. You can't succeed in our society if you don't have an education, and when our schools are turned into police fortresses, and are not providing the education that they're supposed to. When kids feel intimidated about walking through the front door because they have to go through a gauntlet of metal detectors, have their bags searched, get patted down, and get sassed, it really undermines a fundamental human right. Well, school safety agents sometimes will curse at kids. I mean, we have documented in our report cases where school safety agents, you know, accuse kids of, "Where'd you get that jacket? You can't afford a jacket like that." Refer to kids, you know, their physical attributes, you know, in derogatory terms. You know, it's just there are now 5,000 school safety agents in the New York City public schools.
Who is in charge of them?
They are entirely under the control of the New York Police Department. They are peace officers. And just to give you a sense of how many that is, if this were a police department, if the school safety division were its own police department, it would be the 5th largest in the nation. Like Washington, D.C., and L.A. And unfortunately, the Department of Education has abdicated its, you know, time-honored responsibility to enforce school rules, you know, like don't wear a cap, you can't be in the hallway between classes, you need a pass, things like that. They've abdicated the responsibility to discipline students on minor issues. It's all in the hands of the police department. And nowadays, you're in New York City public school.
How many are they from grade school up, or are they just in high
Mainly
schools?
It's junior high and high schools.
How many schools? Do you know?
I forget the exact number. There are hundreds of schools. But kids are arrested for, you know, being late to class. A junior high school student was arrested for writing the word "okay" on her desk. Okay. You know, principals have been arrested.
Well, so what happens? I mean, she writes "okay" on her desk. What happens? The teacher calls the school safety?
In this case, the principal called in the cops, you know, which you have to question the wisdom of that. But you also, I mean, all around there's
a sense of
there's treating the children as if they're not emerging adults, they're not growing up, they're not learning, and also applying the rules of the street. You know, the New York Police Department is very proud of its zero tolerance approach to crime. Well, if sassing a teacher, wearing a cap, cursing a school safety agent, you know, lands you in the clink. You're not teaching kids that school is a safe place for you. You're not teaching them about progressive discipline. You're not teaching them alternative means of resolving disputes.
You're not even teaching them that it's good to go to school.
Well,
you're teaching them don't go to school, stay away. How are they trained? How are they recruited, school safety agents?
Oh, that's a really good question, Ronnie. I wish I knew. We have been trying to get information about the training. We've also tried to sort of participate in the training. We think it's really important that school safety agents, you know, be well trained, understand about kids' rights. The Civil Liberties Union's expert on rights. We're not expert on adolescent developments, but
obviously they aren't either.
Well, claro, they're not. And the sad thing is that so many kids suffer so terribly. BICO, a soccer player at Tilden, one of the worst schools in the city, one of the worst, is late for chemistry class. He's rushing to get to chemistry because, why? He stayed late to talk to his math teacher. He was a good math student and he was engaged. He's late to chem lab. He gets grabbed because the bell has already rung. He forgets to pick up his pass from the teacher in math class. And P.S. what happens? He's thrown up against the wall by a cop. He's bruised, he's cut, he ends up in the emergency room, he's under arrest, he's facing criminal charges, and he couldn't even get a transfer out of that school in the middle of the year.
Are you representing him in court?
We're representing him in this suspension hearing.
Yeah. It's the schools are already at a disadvantage. They're large, they're industrial, they have that terrible noise. I mean, the walls are, it's just a place that reminds you if you've been in a correctional facility almost sometimes, right? I mean, teachers, they try to put artwork sometimes they don't. And when you have to go in and you go through the, it's just, it's a totally demeaning and obvious and discouraging thing.
Right, it treats the kids like they're suspects.
Yeah.
And as an adult going in there, going into some of the schools,
anytime I go into the school,
demeaning.
They're, who are you? Sign your thing, ID. They're not even civil.
Right, but there are some wonderful schools, and there are some schools that have been turned around. And in our report, we document how Julia Richmond Educational Complex over in the East 60s, which used to graduate like 10% of the students, was turned around. It was filled up with small schools with a vision. And the first thing they did at Julia Richmond was get rid of the metal detectors.
But you brought up such a sore point, because now the City University and the Department of Education is considering moving those people out in order to give the building to Hunter College.
Well, hopefully that won't happen. Julia Richmond is
a remarkable place.
It's a remarkable place. You walk in there. I was in there with somebody who had taught in one of the city schools and left, and we took a tour, and she said, I had forgotten what a real school feels like.
It has a wonderful library. It's got a child care center. It's got a school for autistic children. It's got high schools where they have debates and elections and talk. I've gone to speak there.
Right, and they don't teach to the test.
Yeah, a school that people come from all over the world to visit.
Yeah.
And we show our lack of respect for it by considering it's movable.
It would be a real blot on the Bloomberg administration legacy.
Why don't
if they don't
will you represent them?
That school.
Can they sue somebody? You'll represent them?
They're working through the parents and doing a lot of advocacy, which is really important.
We have so many reports. I'm not going to go to the Civilian Review Board because we know that story by now. Talk about history, right?
Yeah.
Unbelievable. Military recruitment in the schools.
Well, one of the little known pieces of No Child Left Behind is a requirement that in order to maintain your federal funding, you need to, a school district needs to ensure that the military has equal access to the schools with college recruiters and other employers. In addition, schools have to turn over the names of their juniors and seniors on request of the military, as long as they give the students an opportunity to opt out. This has resulted in an unprecedented wave of military presence in the schools. New York has been responsive to some extent. The DOE has promulgated some guidelines that help protect students from abusive, overly aggressive harassment by military recruiters, but it has done precious little to make sure kids know what their rights are, have a place to complain, and those guidelines are actually followed. So we recently put out a report, We Want Youth, with Scott Stringer's office, which documents that kids don't know about their right to opt out, and that there are a number of schools where the military recruiters, particularly high minority schools, military recruiters are there on a weekly or monthly basis. Equal access is not weekly, monthly. The college recruiters show up once a year. It's once a year. It's career night. You know, so the military has really exploited this provision of the Bush administration's, you know, educational program, No Child Left Behind, to get into the schools in ways that are unprecedented. And there's documented cases, not just from the NYCLU, but from the Government Accounting Office, from the federal government, of abuse, sexual harassment, intimidation, lying, fraud. And you know, we're urging, as Congress is considering the re-upping No Child Left Behind, that they get rid of this unfunded mandate and condition unrelated to education.
Do we have any figures about the number of high school students that have enlisted?
We don't.
Yeah,
we
that
don't.
would be interesting.
Yeah, yeah, you know.
It's so that's a very. Do you hand these things? Do you have this?
Yeah, we have actually
no
what we do.
Left recruited.
Right, and we have one in Spanish also, which we give out in the schools. We're doing it now because now is the period where the military is putting out their requests for student names, and students can use the form on the back to opt out. And so, and these are available from the NYCLU on our website, which is nyclu.org. And if you just sort of write in military recruiting, you can.
It's also a very
copies.
interesting and comprehensive website, so people should just look at it. Just
our
for
website is great for any student who's interested in learning about any civil liberties issues, free speech,
Doesn't
religion.
have to be students. It could be anybody.
Right.
And we should have more people who are interested.
Right.
We're contemplating a plan now to decrease congestive the traffic, the congestive pricing, and part of that means increased surveillance cameras. But we have a lot of surveillance cameras anyway in the city, right?
We have more surveillance cameras than we can count.
And it's interesting, even when you watch Law and Order, which everybody does, right?
Right.
They always get the person because they've had a surveillance camera in this place or that place and you didn't know about it. So let's talk about that.
Well, the Civil Liberties Union did a survey of Manhattan back in 1998 when Norman Siegel was the director. How many surveillance cameras are we? Are we a surveillance camera town? And we came up with, on the whole island, somewhere about 2,300 cameras. Well, we decided to repeat that survey.
Now, were they including the cameras in banks and things?
Anything that was
Outside.
out on the street. And we knew it was an undercount, but you know, it was a high number. Anyhow, there were very few government cameras back in 1998. We tried to repeat that 2 years ago, and we got through a quarter of Manhattan. We had to stop. There were so many. We found 7 or 8 times as many cameras in just 20% of Manhattan, and we know that since then there are thousands more.
Are these on the street?
On the street.
Around.
On the street. But if you go through Midtown Manhattan, you can't go through Midtown Manhattan without your progress being captured on videotape, either government cameras or private surveillance cameras. It used to be that most of the cameras were on the loading docks, you know, to prevent theft and do inventory control, whatever. Now there are thousands of new government cameras, subway cameras, red light cameras, traffic cameras, you know, go to 42nd Street and 5th, look around. Go to 34th and 7th, look around. You'll see these globes. They look like lights, they're not.
What about in front of the stock exchange?
Tons. I happen to know that because my office is not far from there, and I know that when I'm on my bicycle tooling around, it's on camera.
Who looks at these
That's
tapes?
a really good question, Ronnie, and that's part of the problem that we have. You know, any particular camera is not objectionable, but when the government installs thousands of cameras with no rules, no notice to the public, no guidelines that are available to us, at least, about who has access, how long is it preserved, where does it go, what happens, what do you do to make sure that it doesn't go to the wrong people. There's very little available from the police department, from the housing authority, about what safeguards are in place to protect our rights to not have our picture broadcast all over the place. And in fact, you know, the housing authority cameras, which were installed, you know, over the past bunch of years, captured a guy committing suicide on tape. And that's a perfect example of what these cameras can and can't do. Yes, did it help us figure out what happened? Yes. But that video ended up on some sadomasochism site on the internet. Was anybody ever held accountable for that? Did the police department do an investigation to find out what happened? I don't know. We don't know.
Do they respond if they see something, if they see a criminal act being in progress? Do they respond to it?
Well,
no.
they can't.
It's not hooked up, right?
You know, except in rare circumstances when it's set up. You know, the feed is into somebody who's watching. But typically, a video camera can record what happened. But can it stop a terrorist attack? No. Can it stop a crime in progress? Can it come to the aid of somebody in distress?
What is the basic purpose?
So the basic is to make a record. So and now we live in a society where the government is desperate to get all the information it can. But does it necessarily connect the dots? No. And what do we lose? We lose our privacy.
And our freedom, then.
And our freedom.
The congestive traffic thing, is that, are you going to object to the surveillance cameras there?
We have no problem with congestion pricing.
Yeah.
What we have a concern about is whether what record is going to be kept of our comings and goings to and from the congestion zone. Who has access? How is the information safeguarded? In other words, what are the privacy implications?
Like the Easy Pass, right?
It's a little bit like Easy Pass, except for that you have a choice. I mean, some people say you don't have a choice with Easy Pass because otherwise you have to spend an hour at the toll. But here you have no choice. And the government, if the government is retaining a permanent record of every time any car goes into Midtown Manhattan or moves about there, I think New Yorkers have cause for concern.
We've come to the end of this program.
Oh, no, that was so fast.
Yes, we have, and I'm so pleased that you're here. I admire your energy, your consistency, your ability to protect our rights, and I do hope that you manage to overcome a lot of the things that we have fear about and that we would like to abolish. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ronnie.
If there are any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore, please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.